Whether they're to be the best of times or the worst of times, one thing's for sure, nobody chooses the age into which to be born. All we can do is decide who we want to be and try our hardest to make the best of things. Like anyone else, Tang Xianzu had no control over the age in which he was to be born. His first inkling of what his future might be came in a dream he had one night while still in his early 20s. In this dream, he met a sea god who showed him the most amazing, dazzling treasures. Was this what fate had in store for him? If so, it wouldn't come to him without a struggle. Shortly after, an augur appeared and told him that the road ahead would be rocky. So, waking in the dead of night, Tang Xianzu turned the dream into a poem. Prophecy or not, that dream and the poem it inspired would shape Tang Xianzu's life, becoming the main theme of his life's work, 4 Dreams in Lin Chuan. Of these 4 works, the Peony Pavilion would prove to be Tang Xianzu's enduring masterpiece. It seems to have been the work that most pleased him. As he memorably put it, "If I had not come to the garden, how could I have tasted the beauty of spring?" The flowers glitter brightly in the air, around the wells and walls deserted here and there. Words that are shot through with a sense of sadness that continues to endear the Peony Pavilion to audiences hundreds of years after it was written. This quality is embodied in one of Tang Xianzu's greatest creations, Du Li Niang, one of the greatest female roles to grace the stage of China, indeed the world.
姐姐，小生哪一去不寻到，却在这里，恰好在花园内。
The story of Du Li Niang is a simple one. A young woman in the prime of her life dreams of a man. On waking, she's convinced she will meet him. When he fails to materialize, she's inconsolable and dies shortly after. But there's a twist. When the judge of the underworld learns of her story, he's so moved that he allows her soul to return to Earth so she can meet her beloved at midnight. Du Li Niang comes back to life. Transcendent love is the central theme of Tang Xianzu's story, a force so powerful that it can conquer death itself. It's a theme of universal appeal, one reason why the Peony Pavilion continues to resonate with audiences even after 4 centuries. Three years before the Peony Pavilion came into being, far across the sea in London, a young playwright's fame and reputation was growing. Having already penned many works, including A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet, this young English playwright was about to secure his place in world literary history. His name was William Shakespeare. But, strangely, despite the gulf of language, culture, and space that separated them, parallels exist between Shakespeare and Tang. Near contemporaries, their works chime with each other in curious ways. Indeed, the two giants of the stage even died the same year. In early spring 1577, Tang Xianzu was in the capital, his life at the crossroads. He was here to take the imperial examination for the third time. Though he already enjoyed some fame thanks to his talent for writing, success in the prestigious imperial examination was something that still eluded him. Already in his early 20s, he was a relatively old candidate. What's more, with a young family to support, he had responsibilities to fulfill. With the clock ticking, he was determined to make it this time.
张居正是万历年间的一个铁腕宰相，他是内阁首辅，他有权利操纵这个科举考试的，他就想让他的儿子们都能够进榜高中，可是他的儿子们又不太有出息，学业不太优秀，那么一旦他这个考成了状元了，考成了榜眼，会不会在社会上造成负面影响呢？他担心这个，他就想给他的儿子们寻找这个考试的伙伴。打听呢，现在天下这些举子们，谁最优秀？有人就给他推荐，一个是宣城的沈茂学，一个是临川的唐宪祖，这二位最了不起，名声最好。那么张居正说：“那好，就请他们两位到我家来，大家认识认识，就和他的儿子们呢结为朋友。”
Just before the exam, someone called on Tang and his friend, Shen Mao Shua, inviting them to call on Zhong Ju Zheng. Reading between the lines, both men realized that their chances in the exam were about to improve massively. For Tang Xianzu, desperate to be third time lucky, it was a lifeline. In Tang Xianzu's hometown, Linchuan, in today's Fuzhou in Jiangxi province, the genealogy of the Tang clan is preserved at the Memorial Hall of Tang Xianzu. Although not exactly rich by the standards of the day, the Tang family possessed a library of some 40,000 books. But despite being highly cultured and enjoying a good reputation in Wenchongli, nobody in the family had passed the imperial examination and become a senior government official for more than 4 generations. For a family of the Tang's literary pedigree, this was extremely embarrassing. Tang Xianzu, the eldest son in his generation, looks set to be the answer to the family's prayers. Able to write couplet at 5, expectations of this clever little boy ran high. Gifted and intelligent enough to pass the exam, though he undoubtedly was, Tang Xianzu learned more in his teenage years than just how to cope with exams. Even at that early stage, experience had taught him that the pursuit of political success was not everything. This is Tonggo Mountain in Nanchang County of Fuzhou. It was here that the 17-year-old Tang Xianzu was sent to study at the Qianfeng Academy under Luo Rufeng, one of the most foremost scholars and thinkers of his day.
罗鲁方在哲学等等思想方面，他比较多的，一方面受到了王耿的这一系的影响，但是在非常重要的哲学的问题上面，他事实上 是在跟王阳明进行直接的一些对话，他更多的是受到了王阳明哲学思想的一些刺激，然后经过他自己的一些思考，再重新的一些发挥跟阐发。总而言之，他的一个目的就是教导老百姓不要成为坏人，不要干坏事，要做一个好人，尽量多做善事，成为一个有道德的一个人，最终把自己培养成一个君子，或者是成为一个圣人，甚至是个贤人等等。
Tang Xianzu's father hoped that his son would acquire virtue as well as knowledge by studying under Luo Rufeng. He was not to be disappointed. By the age of 17, Tang Xianzu was already forming his own system of thinking. Under Luo Rufeng's tutelage, Tang Xianzu's personality, aesthetic tastes, and outlook on society and life had already begun to take shape. These early years under Luo Rufeng were formative in Tang Xianzu's development. It was probably the sense of virtue instilled by Luo that informed Tang's response to Prime Minister Zhang Zhuzheng's offer. Despite the promise of success that it contained, Tang Xianzu's mind was made up. When Shen Mao Shua showed up at Zhang Zhuzheng's home, Tang Xianzu wasn't with him. So it was that year that Shen Mao Shua topped the list, later becoming a compiler at the National Academy, with Zhang Zhuzheng's son coming second. As for Tang Xianzu, he failed the exam again.
又过了3年，到了万历8年，唐宪祖又一次到北京参加会试。可是这一年呢，张居正的另外2个儿子，一个他老大张敬修，一个他老三张茂修，也来参加会试，和唐宪祖碰到一起了。这时候张居正呢，还想延揽这个唐宪祖，就派人递话，说你来吧啊。 这个，如果你和我的这个孩子们呢交朋友呢，我可以答应你金榜高中，金榜题名。就唐宪祖给他的回答是什么东西？很有意思，说我不敢从处女子失身也。就是上一次考试，我保持着我应有的节操，这一次我也不能为这个事情失身。
But there were other things on his mind apart from his prospects in the imperial examination, the deaths of his 2 daughters. In fact, the examination was a major source of emotional turmoil for Tang. Always busy preparing for the pending ordeal in the capital, he had little time for his children. When they died, feelings of guilt compounded his grief.
他在30岁前后的时候写过一首很感人的诗，那里面说我没有尽到父母的责任，有时候小孩在隔壁哭，我都会很生气，敲敲墙壁让他停下来，我得要念书，不要妨碍我念书。有时候在走廊里看到小孩子嬉闹，我不会去抱他们起来亲近他们一下。 那个大的孩子活到4岁都没有从来在我身边待过一会儿，是啊，他为了什么呢？那么这个情节陪了他一辈子。
But unwilling though Tang Xianzu was to compromise his principles, he couldn't lay aside his pursuit of worldly success. After all, the hopes and dreams of his entire family rested on his shoulders. So, dusting himself down, he returned home and buried himself in his library. But the guilt he felt about his daughters was always there, waiting to bubble up to the surface. It took 20 years, but that sense of sadness and regret would eventually become his masterpiece, the Peony Pavilion.
So the piece that we're making is a brand new story, and it's inspired by modern day people, and we've looked to create a narrative that weaves its way through both the classic text that we're exploring, the Midsummer Night's Dream and the Peony Pavilion, but we are much more focused at the moment on finding a contemporary story, a modern day woman, a story of a lady who is moving in and out of the complexities of finding love, and the dreams of that, and the ideas of that, and the ideals of it, against what the realities might be.
In 1582, while Tang Xianzu was struggling with grief and disappointed ambition, far, far away in England, an 18-year-old lad had problems of his own. Anne Hathaway, the girl who'd clearly given him so much joy, was pregnant. Though many believe that the 18-year-old Shakespeare married her out of true love, others argue that the decision was forced on him. Having made her pregnant, he was honor-bound to marry her. 8 years his senior, still unmarried at 26, old to be single by the standards of the day, Anne Hathaway was in serious danger of being left on the shelf. Shakespeare's father was a prosperous glover, manufacturer of gloves and leather goods. Hot on the heels of business success came local political office. Shakespeare's father went on to serve as alderman and bailiff in Stratford-upon-Avon. Born during the reign of Elizabeth I, Shakespeare grew up in a political and cultural golden age, an era of intellectual, political, and religious ferment that laid the foundations for England's later commercial and imperial expansion. The school that Shakespeare attended from the age of 7 also shaped the future dramatist's mind. Unlike the schools Tang Xianzu went to, Shakespeare's grammar school likely specialized in Latin, drumming the drama, poetry, and history of ancient Rome into the heads of its pupils. It's said that there could be as many as 60 students in a single class, all learning at different levels.
Punishment itself was met out once a week, and the punishment tool would be the birch. The birch itself was made from branches from the birch tree, and this would be on visual display all day, every day, sitting up on my desk. As the lessons would continue, there would be, as I said, 4 or 5 lessons running side by side. Boys will get excited, noise levels will rise, so a simple waving of the birch would remind them to keep the levels down.
Despite the stultifying teaching methods used in those days, the young Shakespeare seems to have enjoyed his school days. According to scholars, Shakespeare's favorite author was probably the Roman poet Ovid, a rich source of material and inspiration for Shakespeare's later poems and dramas. Sadly, Shakespeare's schooling was destined to come to an abrupt halt. When he reached 16, his father's business difficulties forced him to drop out. Shakespeare would never again receive any formal education. But a love of literature was one thing, earning a living another. His schooling at an end, unsure of the future, it's most likely the young Shakespeare helped out with the family business. Probably the last thing he dreamed of in those uncertain times was that he would end up pursuing a career as a playwright. But for now, aged just 18, the script of his life seemed to have been written already. First, he made an honest woman of Anne Hathaway by marrying her. 6 months later, he became a father. With so many people under one roof, life in the Shakespeare household on Henley Street was already hard enough. Now, with the arrival of Anne and her daughter Susanna, it was harder still. And the pressure was set to increase still more. In a few years, by the time he was 21, the twins Hamnet and Judith had arrived. By this point, finding a way of supporting his growing family and branching out on his own must have been Shakespeare's #1 priority. Could his passion be turned into a way of earning a living? At the same time, Tang Xianzu was experiencing something different. In the summer of 1586, he met his teacher, Luo Rufeng, in Nanjing after a long separation. By now, Zhang Zhuzheng, the man who had offered to ease Tang's way to exam success, was dead. Ironically, 2 years later, Tang Xianzu had finally passed the highest imperial exam and become an official in Nanjing. Although not a high position, for the Tang clan, it was a triumph. The curse that denied them an imperial laureate for generations had been lifted. The department he worked in was in charge of rituals, but as most of the rituals were conducted in Beijing, where the emperor lived, Tang Xianzu had very little to occupy his time in Nanjing. With time weighing heavily on his hands, Tang spent much of his time traveling and drinking with friends, doubtless airing his frustrations about his unsatisfying life. By this point, his first wife, Yu, had passed away, and he'd got his second wife, Fu, and his concubine, Zhao. But with a growing family and several women to support, Tang began to feel the pinch. His official salary wasn't enough for him to fulfill his obligations and pursue his active social life. Fortunately, thanks to the help of his family in Linchuan, who occasionally provided him with food, Tang was able to maintain a decent standard of living in the city. This was the situation when Tang Xianzu met his old teacher, Luo Rufeng, in Nanjing.
当时就见唐玄祖，罗汝芳批评过唐玄祖，他说：“你看你们这些年轻人，这些年轻的官僚，你们一天到晚指指点点的，目空一切，有时候常常发牢骚。当然，你们对社会人生又做出什么真正有意义的事情来呢？没有。”唐玄祖听老师批评以后，长夜难寐，他得下决心啊。 要干一点真正对社会人生有实际意义的事情。
By now, the golden years of the early Ming dynasty were long gone. Despite the apparent prosperity, social crisis was never very far below the surface. Personifying this creeping malaise at the very apex of Ming society was Emperor Wan Li, an indolent and incompetent ruler with no aptitude for statesmanship. Where the emperor led, or failed to lead, his ministers and officials followed, laziness and corruption spreading like a plague through all levels of government. The once glorious Ming Empire was teetering on the brink of collapse. For a man of integrity and uprightness like Tang Xianzu, this was no time to be an official. The sense of frustration he felt is summed up in a poem he wrote when he was 37, entitled 37, in which he asks himself how much longer he can stand by and watch his country go to the dogs. Delicate and frail-looking though he was, Tang Xianzu was tough-minded, especially when it came to safeguarding the virtues he held dear. Always upright, he would never stoop to flattery, even for the sake of furthering the political career that he'd long hoped for. A year earlier, his old friend, Su Rulin, a senior official at the Ministry of Official Personal Affairs, had written to him offering to pull strings to help him get a position in the Ministry of Official Personal Affairs in the capital city. Tang Xianzu politely turned down the offer. So Tang Xianzu was faced with a dilemma that stared many in the face during those darkening days: to remain upright but on the sidelines, where little practical good could be done, or to sacrifice principles for the sake of advancement. For Tang Xianzu, whichever way he looked at it, the matter was clear. Stooping meant lowering yourself, ceasing to be the superior man, becoming a low man in high office. What was the use in that? That being the situation, maybe it's no surprise that his focus shifted away from his official career. That same year, Tang Xianzu finally got time to rewrite his previous work, The Purple Jade Flute, transforming it into the complete drama that would become known as The Purple Hairpin. Tang Xianzu's love affair with Chinese opera had begun at an early age in his hometown, Lichuan. In Nanjing, many of his literati friends also enjoyed singing the opera, providing Tang with a receptive audience for the fruits of his creative endeavors. Meanwhile, far away in England, the citizens of London were in the grip of a new mania for plays. From today's perspective, it's difficult to get a sense of the dawning of that golden age of drama, though the street performances, often seen on the streets of today's Britain, might offer a tantalizing hint.
You're going to start throwing me clubs now. Go pick up one club. Don't let the others fall over. You've ruined the whole show.
Each year, different traveling troupes perform in Stratford.
That would be a beautiful donation. Equally, a £10 note would be a marvellous donation. A £5 note, a single blue £5 note.
One summer when Shakespeare was 20 or so, a traveling theater company came to Stratford. Could this be the opportunity the young Shakespeare had been waiting for? It's tempting to imagine Shakespeare mulling things over and asking to join. Whatever actually happened, Shakespeare seems to have left his hometown. The next we hear of him is in London, as an actor in the Queen's Players.
London's growing enormously in this period, and it's becoming increasingly the centre of financial and political life. So in the 1570s, playhouses start to be built as permanent structures in London. And when that happens, these touring companies start to gravitate towards London as the centre of their operations. So by the time Shakespeare comes on the scene, which is 20 years later, there's already an established theatre industry starting to develop.
It seems likely that Shakespeare got into the theater by accident, seizing an opportunity that literally walked by in the form of a band of strolling players. Lucky for him and the world of literature, he did so at a time when the English stage was about to boom. As it was, Shakespeare seems to have taken to his new profession like a duck to water. The rest, as they say, is history. Unlike many other dramas, The Dreamer has no complete script. Many parts of the show come from improvisation during rehearsal. Artists from the Shanghai Dramatic Arts Center think the creative rehearsal of the British artists is fresh and interesting.
So you get something to go, and you just stay talking because you're tall. Can you just lift this one for me? Just back it up, Thomas. And stop, and lift it. Lift it all the way up. All the way up, all the way up, all the way up to there. Now, have you got that strong there?
Over in China, life was very different for Tang Xianzu. The same opportunities that Shakespeare enjoyed were not open to him. But looking at it from another angle, the more constrained environment that Tang lived in was perhaps a major source of creative opportunity. In a preface to a poem, Tang Xianzu wrote about one of his dreams. There was a shabby house where dim moonlight came in through the window. Feeling myself so small like a dwarf, I was anxiously looking for the door to get out, but I couldn't find it. This dream had come to Tang Xianzu at a low point in his life. 42 years old, relieved of his government post, banished to his hometown, and seriously ill, the story of Tang Xianzu looked as if it had run its course. In fact, it was only just beginning. In March 1591, a comet was seen streaming across the northwestern sky. In ancient China, as elsewhere, the appearance of a comet was seen as a sign from heaven, a warning. That's certainly how the slack emperor, Wan Li, interpreted it, issuing a decree of rebuke to government officials for their dereliction of duty. When Tang Xianzu read the decree, he was still an official at the Ministry of Rights in Nanjing, the sinecure he'd been loafing around in for 8 years. As far as he was concerned, the rebuke was a mere formality, the act of a lazy emperor going through the motions. But as a dedicated official, Tang Xianzu had always looked forward to shouldering more responsibilities and giving useful advice at court, just like his fellow townsman, Wang Anshu, who had initiated the Song dynasty reforms, had done. Far from sensing danger in the imperial proclamation, Tang Xianzu saw an opportunity coming his way. So thinking things over, Tang summoned up the courage to take up his pen and write. The result was On Government Officials, a damning indictment of official corruption. In his essay, Tang comprehensively criticized the conduct of government under Emperor Wan Li, listing instances of official misconduct and the actions the emperor ought to take to rectify the situation. Tang Xianzu had taken a massive risk. By criticizing the emperor, he was jeopardizing more than just his political career. He was risking his neck too. But rash as his course of action was, It was perhaps inevitable, given his personality. As it was, it turned out to be a watershed moment in his life. The furious imperial response was not long in coming. In May the same year, Tang Xianzu was relieved of his responsibilities and banished.
以什么下了这个诏书，讲汤显祖这个人物，长久以来负于险局，不是没有得到重任，于是借这个来发泄一下是这样呢。本来是要从重处理，姑且就从轻的处罚，这样呢就把他贬在这个徐闻。
Shortly after Tang Xianzu returned to Lichuan, he fell ill with malaria and was confined to bed. The dream that Tang experienced while he lay fever-stricken and delirious was probably a reflection of his inner turmoil.
在心理学上，40几岁的人有一个观点，就是我们称为自信化。这个词就是我们每个人都活在自己的意识自我中间，观察，或者说你要争取的目标、社会的价值。就等你这个外在的我遇到了挫折、遇到了危机，那这个机会是什么呢？就内在的我开始觉醒。内在我觉醒的时候呢，可能是直通灵魂的。这个内在的我和以后的临川四梦关系密切。那这样的一种变化，我们说是拐点、转折点，就是印在了就是自信化的觉醒，就自信的觉醒和自信化的过程的开始。那当然了，所谓自信化，可以用一种普通的话，就是汤显祖成为汤显祖。
When the crisis taking place in his waking life woke up his inner self, Tang Xianzu started to reevaluate the pressures the outside world exerted on him and turn them into new opportunities. In the context of his later career and development, it's possible to pinpoint this self-realization as the moment at which his theatrical masterpiece began to take shape. Not, of course, that Tang Xianzu was aware of this at the time. Shortly after his recovery, Tang departed for Shuwen on the southernmost point of Guangdong province. Scholars believe that this trip was closely related to his writing of the Peony Pavilion.
那么这一次长途南下，对通常人来讲，很可能就是个伤心之旅。可是汤显祖呢，他一路上都能保持一个很平和的心态。他看到了那么多的新鲜的事物，怀有极大的兴趣。他一路上捕捉和搜寻他看到的这些自然和人文的这些景观，他都把它写进他的诗。 写进他的文章，写进他的戏剧，所以这路上的见闻呢，几乎成了他的创作的一种素材库。
It's possible that the character Du Li Niang began to take shape during Tang's Guangdong sojourn. Some even speculate that he began writing the Peony Pavilion during this trip. As it was, the actual story of Du Li Niang's was not Tang's own invention. In 1594, publisher Hu Huanhuan printed the collection of old-style novels containing a work called Du Li Niang's Story. It related how Du Bao, the governor of Nanshong, had a daughter named Du Li Niang who died of lovesickness. 3 years later, Du Li Niang's soul returned and met her lover, Liu Mengwei. Then she came back to life. In Hua Daluan's book, Notebook in Spare Time, published in the Ming Dynasty, there was a 3,500-word story titled Du Li Niang Coming Back to Life. Precisely where the original story came from remains unknown. What is certain is that the story of Du Li Niang was in circulation long before Tang Xianzu wrote his play.
历朝历代啊，禁止演出的剧目也相当多啊。你亵渎帝王、亵渎圣贤，在明清两代处罚都非常高的啊，是杀头不必说，抄家灭族都有可能的。所以呢，弄得剧作家噤若寒蝉。
Given the constraints on writers, it was much wiser to play by adapting existing popular stories, giving new life to well-loved classics. But that's not to say that Tang didn't create an original work. What's striking about Tang's version is vividness of his depiction of Du Li Niang. Perhaps it was this new take on an old theme, a sense of freshness in his mind at the time, that contributed to his enjoyment of his southward trip. Tang Xianzu passed through Guangdong by water, arriving at Da'u, his first stop-off. At that time, Da'u was the capital of Nan'an Prefecture, taking its name from the Wuling mountain range, a major north-south route linking the Central Plains to the southern part of China, also known as the Plum Blossom Pass, because of the plum trees growing on the mountainside. Reaching the town was a milestone. Tang was now in China's deep south. Precisely what happened during Tang's short stay in Da'u remains a mystery. Interestingly, while the basic plot of the Peony Pavilion is identical to the traditional version, the setting isn't. Rather than taking place in Guangdong's Nanxiang, Tang moves the action to Nan'an in Jiangxi. Maybe Tang's journey through Nan'an and the Plum Blossom Pass inspired him to make that change.
牡丹亭杜丽娘游园一出场，就有一个非常美妙的句子，说小来望断梅关，素妆残。如果你没有经过梅关，你就不会有那么样深刻的印象，你很可能就写不出这么好的句子来。
Mount Luofu, a sacred mountain of Taoism, was also revered by Tang Xianzu. A decade earlier, the 27-year-old Tang Xianzu had met a scholar named Qi Yanzong, who came from this area. After that meeting, Tang's imagination seemed to have become fired up with images of mountains and rivers here.
实质上说，齐彦真是一个通透不羁的人。他虽然进士屡考不中，但不妨碍他好有名山大川，广泛结交朋友。比如说，他为了迎接他的好朋友叶春吉，专门在罗浮山建了一座慈业庵。有一次，他在游玩武夷山之后，困于南昌，身无分文，便作文奇诗，恰巧为汤显祖所见。汤显祖认为这是一个奇人，他的文章也了得，便一见倾心，皆为魔力之教。汤显祖很欣赏齐彦真的俊爽豪迈，称他为海上游侠人。
Sadly, Qi Yanzong fell ill and died just before Tang Xianzu's southward trip, denying Tang the reunion he'd long looked forward to. His sadness and disappointment is evident in the lines he composed after visiting Qi Yanzong's family when he arrived in Guangzhou. Who could be as free as you? The divine enlightenment was so beautiful. The son of Mount Luofu, today you brought me too much sorrow. During his short visit to Mount Luofu, in a frenzy of creative activity stimulated by his loss, Tang Xianzu wrote as many as 17 poems in memory of his friend, Qi Yanzong.
不知什么故事在上，待我看来。哦，原来。
Scholar Zhou Sungfeng believes that Tang's version of the character Liu Mengmei was based on Qi Yanzong, while in the traditional version and the earlier novels, Liu Mengmei was from Sichuan province. In Tang's version, Liu Mengmei is from Guangdong. Another difference concerns the social status of the character. In the traditional version, Liu Mengmei is just the son of a newly appointed prefecture chief with no especially striking strong personality traits. Very different from Tang Xianzu's independent, faithful, and brave Liu Mengmei. In well-to-do Ming Dynasty families, the boudoir of the young lady was known as the shoulo, or the house of embroidery. With neither staircase nor windows low enough for views, servants had to use ladders to supply the occupant with food and water. In those days, young women were more or less imprisoned in these towers, unable to leave until they got married.
大家也知道，明代是个非常讲究贞洁的时代，所以明代的戏曲的明史里边呢，后边的那个《列女传》可以说是历朝历代最多的。也就是说，礼教的对于妇女的压抑是相当强的。
Tang Xianzu's understanding of women is one of his outstanding features as a writer. It's possible that Tang's experiences of politics shaped this sympathy. Constrained by the bureaucratic system of the day and the political inertia of the Wanli years, Tang's life experience had amounted to frustration and boredom, the lot of Ming Dynasty women. With his first-class intellect literally dying to express itself, he naturally felt sympathy for women who had always been denied self-realization. Wu Jingwei plays Du Li Niang in The Dreamer. In this scene, Du Li Niang will have an encounter with the female protagonist, Helena, an exhausted white-collar employee in The Dream. After one day's rehearsal, it's already late at night. Wu Jingwei gets on the car and switches her role from a female actor to a mother of an 8-year-old child. Wu Jingwei's husband is a Chinese with foreign nationality, and he runs his own business. Although they live an affluent life, and Wu Jingwei loves her child a lot, she's not willing to give up her beloved career and become a full-time housewife. Nowadays, women enjoy a degree of freedom unimaginable 400 years ago. This freedom extends not just to careers, but also to more personal matters, like love and marriage. Perhaps that's why this age-old love story still seems as fresh and relevant as ever.